So this next lesson, we're actually going to see if we can put the scientific method into use. On the GD test, you may have to put the scientific method steps in the correct order. So remember, we have the question, the research, the hypothesis. You're testing the experiment, analyzing the data, and then reporting your conclusions. So I have to put those in that order. So I have over here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 statements. And what I got to do is figure out what order do they go in. So this has something to do with kelp. So I'm just going to read this. This is kind of something I pulled off the internet. Let's look at an example that is closer to how an oceanographer might work. The example concerns kelp, a large algae that lives attached to the bottom in shallow water along the west coast of North America, including right off our own coast of San Diego County, which again is part of California. So what we're looking for, though, is they're going to be conducting an experiment about kelp, this large algae. So what we're looking for is a question. And if we look over here, that's got an exclamation point. That's got a period. That's got a period. That's got a period. That has a question mark. So that must be our question, what we want to think about. What controls giant kelp? What controls where giant kelp lives in the oceans? So that's going to be actually our first step, is the question. What controls where giant kelp lives in the ocean? It's got a question mark, so that's easy enough. The next thing is I actually got to go out there and get my hands dirty, so I got to do some research. So I'm looking through these examples and I'm trying to figure out which one of those looks like doing some research. So I may have to actually read these. The intensity of sunlight is an important control where kelp lives in the ocean. That doesn't really sound like research at this point. That sounds like I've already done my research. You go out in a boat around San Diego shoreline and notice that kelp grows in water shallower than 100 feet. That sounds like I'm getting my hands dirty. I'm actually doing some research. So that's going to probably be your second step. So I'm going to move this down a little bit. So again, this sentence here sounds like the research has already been done. The kelp gets sunlight. The kelp that gets the shallow sunlight lives. The kelp that gets only deep ocean sunlight eventually dies. That sounds like an observation statement. That seems like I've already done some research as well. So I'm looking really for a hypothesis. I'm really looking for an educated guess of the why. If I look at this, again, an educated guess is probably going to be a short sentence as well. Giant kelp needs sunlight at least equal to that found at 100 feet to live. That seems like an educated guess. I'm thinking that that's the reason why kelp are living, because that kind of seems to follow my research. I mentioned this 100 feet, so I'm making a conclusion that it seems like kelp does pretty good in shallow water. In other words, water that is under 100 feet deep, not over 100 feet deep. So that's going to be my hypothesis. So now I'm looking for like this experiment. So it looks like this one right here, 2 experimental tanks. I placed 2 groups of kelp. The kelp plants in one tank get sunlight at the intensity found at 20 feet below the surface of the ocean. The group in the other tank only gets sunlight with intensity found at 120 feet. Otherwise, the 2 tanks have identical properties. Again, this is important. I must only allow one factor, in this case, the amount of sunlight, to vary between the 2 tanks. All the other conditions must remain the same. If I change more than one factor at a time, I won't know for certain what factor is responsible for any difference that I might observe. The experiment goes on for several weeks. So to me, that is the experiment. So I'm going to have to move these things down a little bit because I need to get that thing up there a little bit. So that's going to be then my experiment. So I need to still bring these down a little bit. Okay. So that looks like my experiment. Now my analysis. So I have these two left for my analysis. So the intensity of the sunlight is important control on where kelp lives. Kelp can live only in areas with abundant sunlight. That kelp must be at least one of the reasons. That must be at least one reason of the reasons why kelp lives only in shallow water. Because again, the deeper the water, the less sunlight is going to be present. So note there could be other factors that determine where kelp lives. If we continue observing, we'll note that kelp doesn't grow everywhere, that water is less than 100 feet deep. So there must be other things that make an area a good habitat for kelp. Science is an ongoing process of forming and testing hypotheses. To me, that sounds like I'm reporting, which means this must be my analysis. The kelp that gets shallow ocean sunlight lives, and the kelp that gives only uh, deep ocean sunlight eventually dies. So that seems like that's analyzing my data. And this seems like my conclusions. That looks like I'm talking to people outside of my experiment, something I would see in a science log somewhere, a science commentary. So you may have to do that. So notice that, the question has a question mark. It's usually going to be a short statement. The research, you have to be getting your hands dirty. So you have to be actually going out into the real world and conducting an experiment. And then you're going to try to create this educated guess. You're trying to explain why your question is happening. What controls giant kelp in the ocean? And you're suggesting that kelp lives because of how much sunlight it gets, and it dies because how very little sunlight it gets. And then you actually got to do your experiment where you're controlling it. In other words, you're only controlling the sunlight here. So you're setting up conditions that try to mimic that. And then you have your analysis. You pick up on that the kelp in shallow ocean sunlight does well, and the kelp in the dim, deep ocean sunlight doesn't do so hot. And then you report it, and you're looking for something that sounds more like reporting. So again, on the GED test, if you get some of these in the right order, you're going to get points. You don't have to get this in perfect order. It will give you partial points on the GED test. So that can kind of concludes how you may come across the scientific method on the GED. So hopefully you find that useful.